The dusty roadside outside Super Save supermarket shimmered under the Lego sun, and the crowd that usually bustled with noise and bargaining stood frozen like mannequins when a sleek black Bentley glided to a stop, its polished surface catching the light like a jewel dropped in mud. And from it stepped Monica Williams, tall, radiant, wrapped in an elegant cream jumpsuit with heels that clicked against the pavement like a countdown to something unthinkable. Her presence alone enough to make strangers whisper, "That's her, the billionaire tech genius, the software queen, the woman on Forbes Africa." Yet no one could comprehend why such a woman would stride across the street toward a homeless beggar hunched against a stack of empty crates, his ragged coat torn at the seams, his beard tangled, his eyes dulled by years of neglect. And in that surreal moment, silence blanketed the air as she bent slightly, smiled, and introduced herself. "My name is Monica," her voice soft, steady, and full of intent, while the man blinked, taken aback, answering in a hoarse murmur, Jacob Uche," his words carrying the weight of hunger and forgotten dreams. And then, as though the laws of status and sense had collapsed, Monica said something so audacious that jaws dropped and camera phones rose like a forest of antennas. "I've seen you here. I've heard the way you speak about business and data. You sound like a man who once lived in that world, and I believe you just need a second chance. So I'm asking you something crazy. Will you marry me?" A gasp surged through the street like a shockwave, people muttering that perhaps the sun had made her delirious, for who would kneel before a beggar when powerful men begged for her attention? But Jacob only stared, his cracked lips curling into a faint, pained smile as he replied, "If you really mean that, then go inside that supermarket, buy a ring, come back, kneel down, and ask me like you mean it." And the crowd erupted again, some cackling, some clutching their heads, whispering, "Is he mad? Who tests a billionaire?" Yet Monica did not flinch, her heels clicking as she vanished into the aisles of Super Save. And 5 minutes later, she returned, diamond ring in hand, its sparkle brighter than the noon sun. And right there in front of vendors, Okada riders, and school children craning their necks, she dropped to one knee, her cream jumpsuit brushing the dusty ground, and raised the ring with trembling determination. "Jacob Uche, will you marry me?" The beggar froze, disbelief locking his body, his mind racing between shame and awe, until finally he nodded slowly, whispering, "Yes," his voice thin yet strong enough to echo in the silence that had swallowed the street. And as she slid the ring onto his dirty finger, people screamed, cried, recorded, or laughed, but none could deny that history had just been rewritten in front of their eyes. And when she rose and opened the Bentley door, Jacob hesitated, staring at his crusted fingernails, his muddy trousers, and muttering, "I'll stain your seat," to which she replied firmly, "I don't care." And with that assurance, he stood like a man climbing out of a grave, stepped into the car, and left behind the only life he had known for years, unaware that this was not an ending, but the beginning of a story far greater than he could imagine. For as the Bentley hummed softly toward Victoria Island, the beggar-turned-groom clutched his ragged bag to his chest, his eyes darting between the woman who had seen him and the city that had ignored him, his mind refusing to settle on one thought except the echo of her voice. And though his heart thundered with fear, shame, and fragile hope, a new conviction began to kindle within him, like a spark buried under ash. If life could shatter without warning, perhaps it could also be repaired with courage. And maybe, just maybe, he, Jacob Uche, once a scholar, now a man reborn by the strangest proposal Lagos had ever witnessed, could take the broken story of his life and whisper the words that would guide everything to come. I can correct it.
The Bentley purred to a stop outside Kingsman Barber Spa, a palace of glass, marble, and golden trim, where even the air smelled of eucalyptus and money. And as Monica stepped out, the doorman bowed deeply until his eyes lifted to Jacob, still slouched in his ragged brown coat and carrying the black bag that held the remnants of his former life. And in that instant, hesitation hung like smoke, but Monica's firm words, "He's with me," burned it away, and they entered together into a world that had never been meant for men who slept under bridges. Jacob sat stiffly as white towels wrapped around him, warm water coursed through his matted hair, and gloved hands scrubbed years of Lagos dust from his skin, the sensation both humiliating and healing. And as razors clicked, scissors snipped, and scented lather foamed across his jaw, he felt as though layers of grief, shame, and neglect were being peeled from him one by one, each stroke returning a fragment of the man he once was, until the mirror revealed a face he almost didn't recognize, sharp jawline, clean skin, dark eyes flickering with intelligence instead of despair, and hair trimmed into a style that belonged not to a beggar, but to a man who could walk into a boardroom. Still dazed, he was handed a tailored white shirt, black trousers, and polished loafers, and though his hands trembled as he slipped into the new attire, the reflection that emerged was one that startled even Monica, who gasped softly, "Now that's the man I saw." And Jacob, touching his face as though afraid it might dissolve, whispered, "I feel like I just came back to life." Words that made her smile, for she had not rescued a beggar, she had uncovered a scholar hidden under grime. Returning to the Bentley, Jacob's body was rigid, his bag still clutched like armor, and the city outside blurred as the car cut toward Victoria Island, where glass towers gleamed like sharpened spears, and palm trees swayed above high walls. And when the iron gates of a massive white mansion rolled open, Jacob's breath caught in his throat, his eyes widening at the sight of fountains, gardens, and a house that looked less like a home and more like a kingdom. "This is your house?" he asked, and Monica, her voice calm but warm, answered, "No, Jacob, it's our home now." Words that rattled him more than the marble steps or the chandeliers dripping crystal light inside the grand foyer, for he had no category in his mind for being included in such wealth, such grace. And then, on the grand staircase, a little girl with curly hair rubbed her eyes and asked sleepily, "Mommy, who's that?" And Monica crouched to introduce, "Sophia, this is my friend Jacob, and he'll be spending time with us now." And the child, with innocent wisdom, looked him over before asking, "Are you a good person?" And Jacob, throat tight, answered softly, "I'm trying to be." To which she nodded, "Then you can stay, but no scary stories at night." And her words, simple as they were, cracked something open in him, pulling a chuckle from his chest, the first in years. Later that evening, Monica led him to a guest room that looked more like a suite from the Echo Hotel, with silk sheets, wide windows, and a balcony overlooking the glittering city skyline. And when she brought him a plate of hot jollof rice, fried plantain, and chicken, he ate slowly, savoring each bite like a sacrament, until tears burned at the edges of his eyes, because food had never tasted like dignity before. And later, as he sat on the balcony, Monica joined him with 2 glasses of wine, her eyes steady as she asked, "Now, Jacob, tell me, who are you?" And silence stretched as he stared at his hands before finally whispering the story he had buried under bridges and bottles. Once, he had been one of Lagos's brightest data scientists, respected across international firms, building predictive models for banks and governments, teaching seminars, mentoring analysts, until one December morning when a family vacation became tragedy. His wife, his children, and his parents lost in a plane crash he was meant to board a day later, leaving him with nothing but guilt and grief. and unable to face the life he once had, he walked away into the shadows of the city where no one would ask his name. His voice cracked as he confessed, "I lost everything in one day, and I stopped wanting to live." And Monica, her own eyes wet, whispered back, "I know that pain. I lost my parents in a crash, and later my husband vanished when Sophia was still a baby, and I cried for years before I chose to fight again." And in that fragile exchange, brokenness met brokenness and found kinship. And as they sat in silence under the hum of the city and the distant chirps of night insects, something unspoken tethered them both. A recognition that suffering had not destroyed their minds, only buried their purpose. And as Jacob closed his eyes that night on silk sheets instead of concrete, he realized he wasn't simply sleeping in luxury, he was dreaming again, daring to believe that perhaps the life he thought was shattered beyond repair might be corrected.
The next morning dawned differently for Jacob. He woke not to the stench of gutter water or the roar of okadas beneath a bridge, but to birdsong threading through silk curtains, sunlight painting his face, and the smell of fresh bread drifting from the kitchen below. And for a long moment he lay still, afraid the room might vanish if he moved. But when he rose and touched his trimmed beard, ran fingers through clean hair, and saw his reflection in the wide mirror, he realized it was not a dream. He was here, alive, and changed. A knock came, and little Sophia peeked in, smiling. "Good morning, Mr. Jacob. Mommy says breakfast is ready." And when he answered, "Good morning, Sophia. You can call me Uncle Jacob," she giggled and ran down the hall, leaving him with a warmth he had not felt in years. So he dressed and descended to the dining room, where Monica sat radiant in a navy suit, her laptop open beside a bowl of fruit. And as he greeted her shyly, she closed the computer, looked him squarely in the eyes, and said with calm finality, "Eat well, you'll need strength, because you're starting work today." A statement that struck him harder than the diamond ring on his finger, for he nearly choked on his pop and asked in disbelief, "Work? But I haven't touched data in years. I'm rusty, Yet Monica silenced him with a gentle smile. "You were once a top scientist, Jacob. Skill doesn't vanish, it only sleeps. And I didn't propose to you for pity. I proposed because I see a brilliant man hiding in the shadows, and I need you awake." And though his hands trembled, something inside him stirred, a memory of the man he once was. Later that afternoon, the Bentley carried them to M-Tech headquarters, a glass tower that rose like a monument to ambition, its walls shimmering under the sun. And as they walked through the lobby, employees greeted Monica with reverence. But when their eyes shifted to Jacob, confusion rippled. Whispers trailed behind them. "Is that her driver? No, not security either. Who is he?" Yet no one dared ask. Monica led him to the executive floor, opened a door, and revealed a spacious private office with 3 monitors glowing, whiteboards filled with charts, and on the desk a note that read, "Welcome, Mr. Uche, Head of Data Intelligence." Jacob froze, his throat tightening. This is for me?" And Monica nodded. "From today, you'll work directly under me." And he stepped inside, feeling both terrified and alive, as if re-entering a chapter of his life that grief had torn away. He sat before the monitors, hands hovering uncertainly, then moving slowly, testing commands, querying data, exploring dashboards, realizing with each click that though the software was newer, the logic was familiar, the instinct still alive. And within minutes, patterns began to leap at him, anomalies, trends, inefficiencies others had missed. Monica watched from the doorway as the rusty beggar became the scientist again, his posture changing, his eyes sharpening with focus. And that evening, when the offices emptied, Jacob lingered, walking the quiet corridors until he paused by the boardroom and heard something that made his heart ache. A muffled sob. Monica's voice, raw and breaking, as she whispered into the silence about investors, hospitals, and a failing algorithm that risked hurting the very people it was meant to help. Jacob stood frozen, his hand on the cool glass, listening not as a spy, but as a man who understood what it meant to feel crushed by responsibility. And inside the room, Monica sat alone, head bowed, whispering through tears, "We missed it. We failed them. What if the world finds out?" And in that moment, Jacob realized that behind the armor of Africa's software queen was a woman fighting battles no one else could see. Gathering courage, he knocked softly, and when she looked up, startled, eyes red, he entered quietly, sat across from her, and said in a low, steady tone, "You're not alone." Words that felt both simple and revolutionary. For Monica shook her head, admitting, "I don't even know where to start, Jacob. The system is broken. The pressure is crushing. Before she could spiral, he leaned forward, his own eyes wet, and answered with the same line he had been repeating to himself since the day she knelt in dust. "Start here. Start now. We can correct it." And in that fragile electric moment, Monica saw not a homeless man, not even just a partner, but a teacher returned from exile, ready to help her rewrite what was broken. And as the night deepened and the city lights flickered below, Jacob silently vowed that just as Monica had lifted him from the ashes of despair, he would lift her company from the edge of collapse, and together they would prove to the world that no mistake, no tragedy, no fall was too final to be corrected.
The following day, the executive floor of MTech transformed into a war room. Its walls covered in whiteboards scribbled with figures, its tables littered with laptops, coffee cups, and sheets of error reports that painted a grim picture. And in the middle of the chaos stood Jacob Uche, no longer slouched or hesitant, but steady, pointing to graphs with a marker as a team of analysts, engineers, and product managers sat stunned by the clarity of his voice. With calm authority, he explained that the triage algorithm, which MTech had proudly deployed to hospitals across the country, was riddled with hidden bias. Its reliance on proxies like location data, allowing socio-economic disparity to masquerade as medical priority. And while others might have drowned in excuses or panic, Jacob broke it down into steps. First, a full audit of data provenance, every source traced, every imbalance exposed. Second, a complete model refit with fairness constraints that ensured no group was left behind. Third, the integration of a human-in-the-loop system that guaranteed no automated decision would bypass a clinician's judgment. And fourth, radical transparency, a public post-mortem, open acknowledgement of failure, and an invitation for external review. Because, as he told the stunned staff, correction without confession is camouflage, and camouflage will kill trust. Words that hung heavy in the room until even the most defensive engineer nodded slowly. Monica watched from the corner, arms crossed, her eyes shimmering with something between awe and relief as she realized that the man she had rescued from the street was now rescuing her company from collapse. Through the long night, Jacob worked, sleeves rolled, eyes burning with focus, digging through code and data sets, uncovering the exact leak. Zip codes smuggled into the model as predictors, turning poverty into a penalty. And with a circle of his marker, he declared, "Here is the failure, and here is where we rebuild." Then drafted new sampling protocols, weighted loss functions, and fairness dashboards that screamed when disparity emerged. He paired junior analysts with clinicians so they would hear patient stories, not just see rows of numbers. And he showed them how to test not for accuracy alone, but for justice. As the hours passed, the team that had been fractured by shame found itself galvanized, learning not just how to fix code, but how to think differently about responsibility. And when dawn crept over Lagos, they pushed a corrected model live in the test environment and watched as subgroup curves rose together like clasped hands. The room erupted in cautious cheers, and Monica, leaning against the glass, finally exhaled the breath she had been holding for months, whispering to Jacob, "How did you hold them like that, so firm yet gentle?" And he, wiping sweat from his brow, answered, "When you've lost everything, you learn what matters, and then you teach from there. The rest is just technique." And she smiled, knowing she was watching not just a man correcting a system, but a man correcting himself. Later, as the sun cast gold across the city, Jacob gathered the exhausted staff and told them, "From this day forward,
Bias is not an afterthought. It is a bug, and every bug must be corrected before it harms. A line that would soon echo through every corridor of MTech as a mantra. And when the team finally dispersed, Monica lingered by his side, staring at the graphs still glowing on the screens, whispering, "You've done more than save us. You've taught us a new way." And Jacob shook his head gently, not taught, reminded, because deep down we all know what is right. We just need courage to correct it. And in her heart, she knew he wasn't speaking only of algorithms, but of life itself, of grief, of second chances, of love that could rise from ruin. And as they walked out together into the fresh morning air, Monica felt the weight of shame lifting from her shoulders, replaced with something she hadn't felt for months, hope. And beside him, Jacob, once a forgotten beggar, felt the same truth settled deep within his chest, that everything broken, whether code, company, or human soul, could be rebuilt if someone dared to say, "I can correct it."
The press conference was scheduled for noon, and by the time Monica stepped onto the stage at MTech's headquarters, cameras flashed like lightning, reporters jostled for space, and social media was already boiling with rumors about the company's failing triage system. But instead of delivering polished spin or evasive jargon, Monica's voice rang steady and unflinching as she confessed openly, "We made a mistake. Our algorithm carried bias, and it could have cost lives. But today, we are correcting it." And she detailed every step they had taken, the audit, the fairness refits, the clinician overrides, the transparency reports, naming her new head of data intelligence, Jacob Uche, as the mind behind the turnaround. And as she spoke, Jacob watched from the side, struck by how her candor transformed a potential scandal into a declaration of courage. The world expected denial, but instead they saw accountability. And though some critics raised eyebrows, hospitals agreed to pilot the corrected model under oversight, and the storm began to bend rather than break, with employees at MTech applauding quietly in hallways, whispering, "She told the truth. She actually told the truth." And later that evening, on the balcony of the mansion, as Lagos glowed beneath them, Monica placed 2 glasses of wine on the table and looked at Jacob with softened eyes, asking, "Why did you step in like that? Why did you help me when you could have stayed silent?" And Jacob, leaning against the railing, gave a small smile. "Because I heard you cry, and I know what it means to cry alone." Words that pierced her armor more deeply than any headline ever could. She whispered back, "Founders aren't supposed to crack." And he shook his head, answering firmly, "Humans are, and companies crack when humans pretend they don't." And for the first time in months, Monica laughed, short and raw but real, before telling him, "You didn't just fix the code, Jacob. You taught me the class I skipped." And Jacob, his voice low, replied, "I failed that class too once. Pride, haste, certainty. But losing everything taught me to see the signs." And the two of them sat together in silence that felt more intimate than any embrace. Days turned into weeks, and the company's culture began to shift. Engineers now speaking openly about mistakes, analysts no longer hiding anomalies, and Jacob teaching lunch sessions titled "Bias is a Bug, When Accuracy Lies," and "The Ghost in the Proxy." Each attended by employees spilling into hallways, his chalkboard scrawled with equations and parables alike, until the phrase he wrote at the top of every session, "I can correct it," was repeated so often that it became more than a slogan. It became MTech's identity, a shield against arrogance and a sword against despair. Monica watched this transformation with quiet pride, her respect for Jacob deepening with every passing day. Yet beneath her admiration stirred a personal question she could no longer suppress. And one evening, as rain pattered gently outside, and the city lights pulsed below like veins of gold, she turned to him on the balcony and asked softly, "Jacob, do you still want to marry me?" And though the question startled him, he did not laugh it away or hide behind doubt as he once might have. Instead, he looked at her with clear eyes and answered, I never stopped. And in that moment, the weight of dust, bridges, grief, and shame lifted from both of them, replaced by the fragile but undeniable truth that what began as a spectacle outside a supermarket was growing into a bond forged in fire, humility, and second chances. And as the night deepened, Jacob silently promised himself that the next time he knelt, it would not be to test her courage, but to declare his own. And the thought alone filled him with a quiet, burning hope that perhaps, for the first time since tragedy tore his life apart, his story was no longer collapsing. It was correcting itself into something new.
The rooftop of the mansion glistened after a soft rain, the tiles damp, the night sky stretched like velvet over Lagos, with traffic lights pulsing far below like veins of fire. And it was here, beneath the hum of the city and the hush of falling droplets, that Jacob Uche finally stood, heart pounding, a small velvet box hidden in his trembling hands, while Monica, seated at a candlelit table, tilted her head in mild confusion as he cleared his throat, his voice steady yet laden with emotion. "Monica, I owe you more than words can ever measure, because the day you knelt in the dust, I thought you were insane, and I tested you with cruelty, asking you to kneel with a ring, thinking no one of your stature would humble herself. But you did, and in that moment I realized courage sometimes wears madness as a disguise." And as he spoke, he slowly bent one knee, mirroring the memory that had bound their lives together, but this time with reverence, not rebellion, pulling the velvet box open to reveal a platinum ring that gleamed like a star in his calloused hand. "You taught me belief when I had none. You taught me to correct what was broken instead of burying it. And tonight I want to answer the question I left hanging in the dusk. Monica Williams, will you marry me?" For a heartbeat, the world seemed to freeze, Monica's eyes widening, her lips parting as tears welled and spilled down her cheeks before she whispered, trembling, "Yes, yes, Jacob, 1,000 times yes." And as he slid the ring onto her finger, the city itself seemed to roar with unseen applause, Sophia leaping from the doorway where she had been secretly watching, clapping her tiny hands with joy. "He asked! Mommy, he asked!" And Monica laughed through tears, pulling Jacob up into her arms, the embrace both fierce and tender, sealing a promise that had begun as scandal and now blossomed into destiny. Weeks later, their wedding was held not in the grandeur of a 5-star hall, but in a ceremony rich with meaning, a blend of tradition and elegance. Drummers beating rhythms of joy, elders offering prayers, guests wiping tears as Monica walked down the aisle in ivory lace, while Jacob, dressed in a tailored agbada, stood waiting with a gaze that carried gratitude more than pride. And when the vows were spoken, Jacob did not promise riches or power. He promised correction, saying softly, "Everything great we have done, we did twice, the second time the right way. And I vow that in our life I will keep correcting myself for you, for Sophia, for us." Words that drew murmurs through the crowd and left Monica's heart trembling with love. The celebration that followed was luminous but not wasteful, filled with laughter, music, and a sense of renewal. And when the final guests departed, Monica and Jacob walked barefoot through the empty hall, their shoes dangling from their fingers, echoing laughter still bouncing off the walls. And she asked him quietly, "What do you want next, Jacob?" And he, gazing at the stars through the high windows, answered not with ambition, but with conviction. "A place where correction is not shame, but a path, where people broken like I was can find their way back, not through pity, but through purpose." And Monica smiled, squeezing his hand, whispering, "Then we'll build it together." And in that hushed, sacred exchange,
The seed of something greater was planted, not just a marriage, but a mission. And as they left the hall, hand in hand, their shadows stretching long against the ground, the world ahead seemed wide and waiting, ready for two people who had walked through fire and chosen to rebuild with love, humility, and the belief that nothing, not even the most shattered life, was beyond correction.
The morning sun poured gold over a sprawling compound on the edge of Lagos, and outside its gates, a banner fluttered in the breeze with bold letters that read, "The Uche Foundation, your story isn't over yet." And as dignitaries, journalists, and ordinary citizens gathered, Monica and Jacob stood side by side, their hands entwined, watching as the vision that had once been whispered in the quiet of their wedding night finally unfolded in brick, glass, and purpose. Inside the compound were dormitories painted in warm earth tones, classrooms humming with newly installed computers, counseling rooms where silence would be treated with dignity, and a vast auditorium waiting for voices that had been ignored too long. And as the ribbon was cut, applause thundered, cameras flashed, and children who once hawked water on Lagos roads now carried tablets in their hands, stepping through doors into a future they never thought possible. Jacob himself opened the first lecture, standing before a chalkboard with sleeves rolled up, his voice steady as he drew a circle, then cracked it with a line, telling the wide-eyed audience, "Perfection is a myth, correction is a method. Every one of you can begin again." The room leaned forward, drinking in words that sounded less like instruction and more like resurrection. He paired coders with carpenters to design real tools for real neighborhoods, taught data literacy to grandmothers who had never touched a mouse, and reminded every participant that mistakes were not stains, but signposts pointing toward growth. Monica, meanwhile, led entrepreneurship sessions where profit was braided with compassion, teaching young widows how to turn sewing skills into brands, and orphans how to pitch apps with confidence. And at the end of each week, the foundation hosted Clinic Night, where anyone could bring something broken, a CV, an app, a dream, and the whole room would repeat the line Jacob had made famous, "I can correct it," transforming despair into collective energy. Soon, journalists who came hunting for romance found instead case studies, spreadsheets, and a wall of failures proudly displayed with annotations of how each one was fixed. And the internet buzzed not with gossip, but with admiration. Videos of barefoot teenagers presenting projects to international investors going viral, and whispers spreading that this was not charity, it was justice. One afternoon, a hospital director reported that the corrected triage algorithm, refined under Jacob's methods, had reduced disparity by 40%, and the foundation's model was invited into universities as curriculum, with a new course titled When Accuracy Lies, based entirely on Jacob's sessions. The impact rippled outward. Street boys now in clean uniforms presenting inventions, widowed mothers leading design classes, once forgotten men and women standing on stages telling their stories of restoration, and every plaque carried the foundation's motto, "Your story isn't over yet." That evening, standing on the rooftop of the new building, Monica leaned into Jacob's shoulder as the city lights stretched below, whispering, "This feels like the real company." And he, gazing at the laughter rising from the courtyard, answered softly, "Because the product is people." And together they stood watching as the sun dipped low, knowing that in giving others second chances, they had cemented their own. And though the world might call them visionaries, they knew the truth. They were simply broken souls who had chosen not to hide their cracks,
but to teach correction as a way of life. And in that choice, they had lit a fire that would keep burning long after they were gone.
Years drifted by like pages turning in a story too rich to rush, and the Uche Foundation, once a daring dream whispered under candlelight, now stood as a continent-wide movement, its branches spreading to Ghana, Kenya, South Africa, and beyond, each facility humming with the energy of second chances, its walls echoing with the laughter of children once left on the streets, the determination of widows once silenced by grief, and the breakthroughs of young innovators once told their ideas had no value. Jacob and Monica, though older now with silver streaks gracing their hair, walked the grounds hand in hand, greeted not as unreachable icons, but as parents of a family that had outgrown bloodlines. And on one crisp morning, the Nigerian Ministry of Science and Technology honored them with a Lifetime Impact Award. Banners at the landmark center displaying their journey from a dusty roadside proposal to a legacy of redemption. And when Jacob stepped onto the stage in a black suit sharp against his weathered skin, his voice trembled but never broke as he declared, "My name is Jacob Uche, and once I was a man lost beneath a bridge, convinced my story had ended. But then someone saw me, knelt before me, and gave me the courage to believe that even broken things can be corrected." And as the hall erupted in a standing ovation, Monica rose to embrace him on stage, her tears proof that love and purpose had indeed rewritten their lives. At home that evening they sat on their favorite garden bench, roses blooming around them, Sophia, now a brilliant doctor, leading a health tech startup with her husband, little Williams coding apps that reached rural classrooms, and Amarachi, their granddaughter, scribbling children's stories inspired by their grandparents' love. And Jacob sighed with quiet contentment, whispering, "I am full," to which Monica, leaning her head on his shoulder, replied, "Me too, but I still want more, for them, for those yet to come." And he chuckled, "Of course you do. You've always dreamed bigger than the sky." And she kissed his cheek softly. Later, Amarachi ran to them holding a sketch, her small fingers clutching paper, with a drawing of a woman kneeling before a man, above it written in bold letters, "Love begins where pride ends." And Jacob chuckled through tears, "She gets it," while Monica whispered, "She comes from it." As twilight painted the garden gold, they spoke of legacy, of how the Uche Foundation must outlive them, of how stories of broken kings and fearless queens must continue to remind the forgotten that they too can rise. And in that gentle dusk, Jacob realized he no longer feared death, for he had already lived resurrection. When the final years came, they came not as thieves, but as honored guests, greeted with laughter, wisdom, and gratitude. And one quiet evening, sitting hand in hand, Jacob turned to Monica and asked, "Do you regret anything?" And she smiled through the wrinkles of time, whispering, "Only that we didn't meet sooner." And in his chest he felt the truth swell. Every moment of despair had led him here. Every failure had been a prelude to correction. And as the sun dipped behind the horizon, and the voices of children from the foundation carried across the garden, Jacob closed his eyes, whispering to the wind, "Everything broken can be rebuilt, if someone dares to believe." And those words, etched in the hearts of everyone who had known them, became the final lesson of their story, that correction is not a single act, but a way of life, a legacy that turns grief into grace, shame into strength, and strangers into family. And so their tale did not end with silence, but with a movement,
a reminder that the power of belief, humility, and courage can transform the lowest dust into a crown, and that no matter how far a person has fallen, they can always rise again by choosing the words that gave Jacob his redemption. I can correct it.
And so, from a dusty roadside outside Super Save supermarket to the grand halls of global recognition, Jacob Uche's life proved one unshakable truth. No matter how broken, forgotten, or lost you feel, your story is not over yet. Correction is possible. Hope is possible. Love is possible. If you believe second chances can rewrite destinies, type "I can correct it" in the comments. Share this video with someone who needs hope today. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable tales. Until next time, remember, sometimes the miracle you pray for begins the moment you dare to believe.